The whispering pact in the center of the galaxy, there lived a race no one feared. They had no weapons, no armies, no empires. They lived in floating crystal cities and sang to their crops. They were called the Serenai, the gentlest species in the galaxy. They never raised their voices, never told others what to do. They were soft, glowing beings made of light and harmony. And for 10,000 years, they stayed silent in all wars. They were trusted because they never chose a side. But then came the humans, and everything changed. The first time the Serenai saw a human, it was not in war, it was in pain. A human ship named Ravager 9 crash-landed on their sacred moon. The ship was broken, burned, and leaking fire across the sky. Inside were only 12 survivors. Barely alive, the Serenai could have ignored it, but they didn't. They floated toward the wreckage. Glowing softly, they reached out with hands made of energy and calm. They whispered to the trees and the hin. Trees bent to clear a path. They touched the human wounds and began to heal them. Not with machines, but with a strange warmth that felt like peace. Captain Elias Monroe opened his eyes, saw the glowing beings, and thought he was dead. But he wasn't. He was safe, for the first time in weeks. The Serenai didn't ask questions. They gave food, water, and shelter in their floating temples. They watched the humans carefully, not with fear, but curiosity. Humans were loud, angry, scarred from war, but they were also strong, honest, and never begged. The Serenai saw something hidden deep inside their eyes, something even the strongest species in the galaxy didn't have: fire, and that fire made them choose. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Serenai made a decision. They would not stay neutral. They would not stay silent. They would help the humans, even if it meant breaking every old law, even if it meant war. One Serenai elder whispered a single word, a word no one had heard from them in centuries: enough. That whisper traveled through their oceans, their skies, their data streams. It echoed across stars and satellites. It shook the roots of their ancient cities, and it reached the Galactic Council, the council, made of the strongest 12 species. Laughed. The Serenai had never interfered before. They had no weapons, no fleets. What could they possibly do? But the council forgot something. The Serenai were not weak. They were peaceful. And there is a difference. Back on the Serenai moon, Captain Elias stood on a high balcony. He looked at the floating cities glowing under the twin moons. He didn't know why these beings had helped him, but he felt something in the air, like the world was holding its breath. He asked the elder Serenai, "Why are you doing this?" The elder replied without blinking, "Because you remind us who we used to be." Below them, a garden full of light started to shift. Small silver orbs rose from the soil and floated into the sky. They moved without sound, but with purpose, ancient technology the Serenai had buried long ago. Not for war, but for protection. That night, the stars blinked in fear, and across the galaxy, whispers began. The Serenai had chosen. They had broken their silence, and they had chosen Earth. It was not a shout. It was not a war cry. It was a whisper, but it was louder than any weapon the galaxy had ever known. And the rest of the galaxy was not ready for what came next. The wounded starship, the sky above the Serenai moon, cracked open like glass. A ball of flame came crashing down through layers of clouds. It screamed as it fell, a trail of fire and broken metal behind it. Birds fled. Oceans boiled beneath its descent. The trees of Lumerus, the capital island, bent away from the heat. Was not a meteor. It was a human ship, and it was dying. The vessel slammed into the white sand with a roar. Wings twisted, engines coughing sparks, its name barely visible, Ravager 9. Inside, humans cried out in pain, some already gone, others slipping. The Serenai had never seen such violence fall from the sky. For generations, no one had dared disturb their peace, but now something had fallen into their sacred lands, and it was breathing, bleeding, and whispering for help. Aldervelin, a Serenai guide of 800 years, floated to the impact site. His body shimmered like morning dew under a soft moon. He reached out a hand not made of flesh, but of light and memory. The wreckage hissed and popped, still hot to the touch. Yet he did not pull away. One of the survivors, a tall, bearded man, opened his eyes. His voice was cracked and dry. "Please, don't let them find us." Then he passed out. Velin paused. Something in the human's voice did not sound like fear. It sounded like warning. The Serenai moved fast, but gently. They did not use machines. They sang, and their songs moved vines and stone to carry the wounded to safety. No cameras, no reports, no alarms, only silence. 12 humans were pulled from the wreckage. 3 would not wake again. The rest were kept inside healing domes filled with soft blue mist. Serenai healers touched their skin and saw flashes of war, betrayal, fire, and something darker, something the Serenai had tried to forget. One young healer, Lyra, cried as she touched a child's hand. The boy had no name tag, no rank, just blood on his forehead and a photo clutched tight. It was of a dog and a woman smiling under Earth's sun. Lyra felt her chest tighten. This was not just a crash. This was a cry for help that no one had answered, except them. Captain Elias Monroe was the last to wake. His body was broken, his ribs cracked, but his mind was clear. He looked around at the glowing structures, the quiet sounds, and said, "This isn't hell." Lyra smiled softly. "No, it is home." Days passed. The Serenai kept the humans hidden, not because they feared the council, but because they needed time to understand why their hearts had changed. They watched the humans laugh, cry, fight among themselves, and then hold hands. They saw something raw, honest, and painful, but beautiful. The Serenai had watched 1,000 species, but none burned like humans. Then, one night, the stars blinked again, not from beauty, but from danger. A probe had found the wreckage. A message arrived in Serenai space. From the Galactic Council, it read, "You will surrender the humans immediately. Neutrality is not immunity." Elder Velin stood before the message crystal and said nothing for hours. When the sun rose, he turned to his people and said only one word. No, that single word spread like wind across water. It rippled through the floating cities, through the song vines, through the hearts of every Serenai, and they began to remember. They remembered why they chose peace and what they once were before it. On the edge of the forest, a door long sealed opened. Behind, it was not a weapon, but a memory of when the Serenai had almost destroyed themselves and chose never to again. Now, for the first time, they were choosing something else. They were choosing to protect, not because humans asked, but because they deserved it. And far away, deep in council space, a cold voice whispered, "If even the Serenai have chosen sides, the old galaxy is ending." The gentle rebellion, they were known for peace, for silence, for never saying no. But that was before the Serenai chose to protect humanity. And now, the galaxy would hear their answer. Not shouted, but whispered so. Clearly, no one could pretend not to hear it. The Galactic Council did not expect resistance. They believed the Serenai would obey. Like always, peaceful species do not rebel, they thought. But they were wrong. When the Council's warning arrived, the Serenai did not send a reply. They sent something else, silence. Not the kind of silence that meant fear. This silence had weight. This silence made diplomats lose sleep. This silence meant change. In the crystal halls of Lumerus, Elder Velin met with the other guides. They stood in a circle of light under the tree of memory. Each of them had lived hundreds of years. Each of them had vowed never to interfere in galactic wars. But today, they broke that vow. The Council believes we are weak because we do not strike, said Velin. They forget. We do not strike Because we remember how much it costs. The others nodded slowly. None of them smiled. This was not joy. This was duty. They opened the vault of first light, sealed for 10,000 years. Inside were no guns, no bombs, only silver orbs, sleeping in rows, humming gently like lullabies. Old tech, pre-peace tech, machines made to protect, not to harm, but protection, true protection, can still terrify. The orbs lifted from the vault and hovered over the gardens. They scanned the skies, not to attack, but to shield. If the Council sent warships, they would not get through, not without losing something they couldn't get back. Elsewhere on the Serenai moon, the humans were watching too. Captain Elias stood on a bridge of glowing stone. Beside him, young Lyra touched the silver orb floating above her palm. "You were serious," he whispered. Lyra nodded. "We never wanted to choose sides," she said. "But peace does not mean doing nothing." Down in the refugee quarters, the youngest human survivor, Aiden, just 12, drew pictures in the dirt. One was of Earth, one was of Serenai trees, and one was of them, standing together, holding hands. When the guards asked him what it meant, Aiden said, "It means we're not alone anymore." Back on the Council world, panic began. The Serenai had activated their old systems. They were raising barriers no one had seen in ages. And worse, other peaceful species were watching. Some began to question the Council's power. Some began to whisper, maybe the Serenai are right. The rebellion had no soldiers, no war chants, no invasions, but it was growing, and that made it more dangerous than any fleet. For the first time, the Council sent envoys, not threats. But Elder Velen refused to meet them. He sent a message of only 5 words. "Your fear does not guide us." The humans wanted to fight, to prepare, to resist with weapons, but the Serenai asked for something else. "Be still," they said. "Let our choice speak louder than anger." Even Captain Elias, who had fought in 5 wars, stood still, and for once, he realized this was not weakness. This was power he didn't understand yet. Far beyond the moons, Council warships began to move. But they did not attack. They hovered, unsure, because no one wanted to be the one who made the first move against peace itself. The Serenai had drawn a line, not in blood, but in light, and the galaxy had never seen anything like it. The storm above Serenity, the sky above the Serenai homeworld, was always calm. Blue moons floated like soft lanterns, and the wind carried songs instead of smoke. But not today. Today, the clouds above Serenity turned cold, because something dark had arrived. From the far edge of Council space came the Vexor fleet. 6 ships, black as ash, shaped like blades and built for fear. They came with no words, no music, no warning, only silence, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. On the ground below, the Serenai did not run. They walked into the fields and gardens, and looked up, not with weapons in their hands, but with light in their hearts. Captain Elias stood with Lyra at the balcony edge. He looked up and clenched his jaw. 6 warships, he said. Lyra nodded. "Not one will pass." She answered softly. Above them, the silver orbs from the vault of first light began to rise. Thousands of them, like stars lifting from the ground. They glowed gently, singing in low tones that made the air tremble. They weren't weapons, but they weren't afraid either. The orbs formed a shield, a glowing dome around the moon. It shimmered like a soap bubble in sunlight. But when the Vexor fleet fired its first energy lance, the beam hit the shield and vanished. No explosion, no spark, just gone. A second blast followed, louder, stronger. It too vanished into nothing. Then a third, desperate and fast, and that one came back, not as a weapon, but as a reflection. The same energy beam the Vexor had sent returned toward them, twisted, quiet and precise. It struck the outer ring of one of their ships. No destruction, just a full systems blackout. The warship froze in space, powerless. Inside the other Vexor ships, The commanders panicked. "This isn't possible," one shouted. "They're peaceful, they don't fight." But another whispered, "They're not fighting. They're defending." Back on the moon, Elder Valen walked through the floating gardens. He whispered a single phrase that reached every Serenai mind at once. "Let them see what protection truly looks like." All across the planet, the Serenai sang. They didn't sing for war. They sang for memory, for the time before peace, for the time when they were forced to choose again. The orbs above began pulsing in rhythm, not attacking, not chasing, just standing still, unmovable and endless. The council watched from afar, and what they saw terrified them, because the Serenai didn't need violence to win. They only needed resolve, and the galaxy had never seen a resolve so quiet, yet so unshuckable. Inside the warships, the crews began to question their orders. What were they doing? Trying to conquer healers? Trying to silence songs with steel? Morale collapsed faster than systems. In the council chambers, arguments broke out. "Withdraw now," shouted one voice. "They've done nothing wrong," said another. But one voice, cold and bitter, whispered, "If the Serenai inspire others to stand, we will lose everything." They were right, because across a dozen systems, smaller races watched the standoff, and they began to ask questions too. If peace is this powerful, why are we following fear? The Serenai hadn't fired a single weapon, yet they had cracked the council's illusion, and high above, the storm that came to crush them now hovered in confusion, doubt, and shame. Captain Elias looked to the stars and smiled for the first time in weeks. "They didn't expect a storm," he said. Lyra turned to him and whispered, "No, they expected silence." And she raised her glowing hand toward the sky. Above them, the orbs pulsed once more, not in threat, but in promise. The Serenai would not strike first, but if the storm came any closer, it would drown. The council's mistake. They believed power was measured in ships, in lasers, shields, fleets that could block out suns. But the council made one mistake. They thought the Serenai had nothing worth fearing. Now, one of their fleets floated powerless, trapped by a song and a cross. The stars, the other races, began to wake up, not with violence, but with questions. Why did the Serenai protect the humans? Why did they break 10,000 years of silence for them? What did they see that we missed? The council grew nervous, not because of the Serenai's actions, but because of their influence. Change does not always come with explosions. Sometimes it arrives quietly through the voice of someone who never spoke before. And now that voice was spreading. In secret rooms on distant worlds, council members gathered. Holograms flickered with static as arguments filled the air. The Serenai are destabilizing peace, shouted one ambassador. Peace? Another laughed bitterly. They're the only ones who understand it. Someone slammed a hand on the table. The humans are behind this. They must be. They're corrupting the Serenai. Earth must be punished. And in that moment, the council made their second mistake. They stopped fearing the Serenai and started fearing the humans back on Serenity Moon. Captain Elias stood before Elder Velen. The air shimmered with tension. A message had arrived, cold, official, final. The council had given humanity a warning. Leave Serenai space or be considered a threat. The captain read the message out loud, then tore it in half. No, he said simply. No more running. Elder Valen looked into the sky where the orbs still floated like quiet guardians. Then we will stand with you, he whispered. His voice didn't echo. It didn't need to. That night, the Serenai lit every tower in their cities. Not in celebration, but in signal. Across the stars, their message pulsed outward through light-based transmissions to every peaceful world, every observer, every forgotten species. We choose Earth. And that message reached places the council had long ignored. Small planets, trade hubs, wandering colonies. Races who had stayed silent for years now watch the Serenai's courage and ask themselves a simple question: if they can choose humanity, maybe we can too. Suddenly, Earth was no longer alone, not powerful, not dominant, but respected. The council scrambled. They tried diplomacy, they tried threats, they tried silence. But none of it worked, because the Serenai weren't fighting with ships, they were fighting with trust. And trust, once given, spreads faster than fear. Soon, 3 more neutral species announced support for Earth. One of them, the Korethi, hadn't spoken publicly in 400 years. Their only statement was simple: the Serenai have never been wrong. The Council's control began to crack. Worlds they ruled with fear now questioned everything. And worst of all, they had no plan for peace. They had war doctrines, they had invasion maps, but they had no idea what to do when kindness became more powerful than guns. And in a dark chamber hidden beneath the Council's core world, one ancient AI advisor spoke for the first time in centuries. Its voice was cold, logical, and final. If peace becomes contagious, the war economy collapses. Suddenly, Earth wasn't just a survivor. It was a spark, and the Serenai, they weren't just healers anymore. They were the shield behind the flame. The message carved in light long before the Serenai became the galaxy's gentle race. They were something else, something the galaxy forgot, and something they promised never to become again. They were warriors. It was not always light and song. There was a time when the Serenai skies burned red. Their floating cities were ships of war, not peace. Their voices were not soft, they commanded storms. They had the power to crush stars, and they almost did. That time was called the Sundering, a forgotten war where Serenai fought Serenai. Whole oceans boiled, mountains fell, and in the end, only a few remained. Those few chose silence, not because they were weak, but because they had seen the end and refused to bring it to others. This was the secret they had buried, not under the ground, but in themselves. Until now, on the edge of Serenity Moon stood an ancient tower, one no Serenai had entered in 10,000 years. It had no doors, only light flowing endlessly along its glass walls. But tonight, that light began to change. It formed shapes, lines, and then a message. Elder Valen stood before it, his eyes glowing dimly. Lyra stood beside him, trembling. "I thought it was just a legend," she whispered. "It was," Valen replied, "until Earth reminded us who we were." The tower responded to their presence. The ground pulsed gently, then it opened. Inside was silence, not the peaceful kind. The ancient kind, the kind that waits, watches, remembers. In the center of the chamber was a floating crystal, as large as a mountain. Inside it danced light red, blue, white, gold. But this was no hurt. It was memory. Velen reached forward and touched the crystal. It responded by lighting up the entire tower with a glowing symbol. A spiral with 13 points, the ancient sigil of the first pact. The day the Serenai swore to protect not conquer, to heal not rule, and to guide those who walked the edge of fire. "This," Ellen whispered, "is the promise we almost forgot." The light rose through the tower and shot into the sky. It moved past moons, past satellites, until it reached the stars. A message not made of words, but of memory. Across the galaxy, other peaceful races saw the light. And they remembered too. Ancient stories, symbols, feelings. Some cried, some stood still for hours, and some picked up old books they hadn't opened in centuries. Because that light was not just from the Serenai, it was a call to every species that once chose peace and hid, to every world that feared the Council's wrath, to every being who thought kindness was weakness. And it said, "We are still here." Back in the council chambers, panic deepened. One diplomat screamed, "They've reactivated the ancient beacon. They're waking up the old pacts. They're not alone anymore." The AI advisor, turned again. Its cold voice cut through the fear. If even one more race answers that signal, we lose the galaxy. But it was already too late, because across the spiral arms, voices began to rise, not in war, but in light. They lit their skies in the same symbol. They played the same melody the Serenai had shared, and slowly the galaxy started to shift, not from invasion, but from awakening. Captain Elias stood outside the tower and watched the sky, his voice quiet, full of awe. "What did you just do?" Velen replied, "We remembered who we are." And far above, where the stars once felt cold and quiet, a wave of ancient fire moved again. Not to destroy, but to protect. The Serenai had not just chosen Earth. They had chosen themselves, and in doing so, they had shown the galaxy the one thing stronger than war, a promise. The day silence roared, no missiles were launched, no armies crossed borders, no blood was spilled. But on this day, the galaxy changed forever. They called it the Day of Silence, because no one fired first, and yet no one could move. Not the Council, not their fleets, not their fear. Above Serenity Moon, the Vexor ships still floated. Engines cold, weapons silent, trapped inside a glowing web of Serenai light. Their commanders waited for orders that never came. On the surface, the Serenai stood in gardens, towers and temples, holding nothing, wearing no armor, their only shield was the truth, and behind them stood the humans, wounded, outnumbered, but not afraid. Captain Elias watched the horizon, not for ships, but for the moment it would all begin or end. He turned to Elder Velen. "Will they strike?" he asked. Velen closed his eyes. "If they do," he whispered, "they will learn what silence can do." Far across the stars, the Council had gathered in panic. The light signal had spread. More and more worlds were answering the Serenai's message. Worlds that once obeyed now stood still, waiting, watching. It was a rebellion with no soldiers, no bullets, only belief, and the Council couldn't stop it. They sent one last threat, one last chance to crush hope. A new fleet, the Darkburn Armada, built in secret, faster and deadlier than anything before. It left orbit with orders to strike Serenity Moon and erase the Serenai's voice. But as the Armada approached, something happened. They were not met with guns. They were met with silence, not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that demands respect, the kind that makes even monsters hesitate. The sky above Serenity began to glow again, not from weapons, but from the orbs, millions of them, spinning, floating, humming softly. They were not attacking. They were singing, a song older than war, a memory deeper than steel, a promise. Inside the Darkburn Armada, the lead pilot froze. He saw the surface below and felt something strange. Not weakness, but peace, real, heavy peace. He turned off his targeting system, and the next pilot followed, and the next, until the entire Armada stopped moving. Mid-flight, no orders, just silence. And then something impossible happened. The Armada turned around, not because they were forced, but because they chose to. They had seen the Serenai's light, and they knew this wasn't a war. It was a turning point. In council chambers, rage exploded. How could they refuse an attack order? Why did they disobey? But deep down, every leader already knew the answer. The Serenai had won, not with power, but with principle. And in that moment, the council was no longer feared, because something louder than war had been heard, across planets, in cities, in farms and starports. People whispered the words of the Serenai. "We choose Earth, we choose peace, we remember." Captain Elias looked to the stars, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. "You did it," he whispered. Lyra stood beside him, her hands glowing softly. "No," she replied, "we did it together." The galaxy would never be the same, and the story would be told forever. How the gentlest race chose the loudest silence, And the day they stood beside humanity, the stars listened, not to war, but to a whisper that roared.